Good afternoon and welcome to today's conversation with John Scott Railton as part of our series Towards Life 3.0, Ethics and Technology in the 21st Century. I'm Sushma Raman, the Executive Director of the Carr Center, and it's my honor and privilege to welcome you all today to this conversation on behalf of the Center and Mathias Risse, our Faculty Director. For those of you who aren't aware of John Scott Railton's work, he is a researcher, a senior researcher at the Citizen Lab, and his work focuses on technological threats to civil society, including targeted malware operations, cyber militias, and online disinformation. He's done work with colleagues at Citizen Labs on the systematic use of Pegasus software, a software developed by the NSO Group to target civil society activists and journalists in several countries. I first became aware of John's work in the aftermath of January 6th and have been following his work ever since. So delighted to hear from John, and we welcome your comments and questions in the chat that we will draw upon in the Q&A portion. Over to you, John.
Well, first of all, thank you to you and to the Carr Center and the Carr Center staff for making this possible. It's a real pleasure to be here. I'm going to go ahead and get started and share my screen. Please just holler if for some reason it's not visible. So last check, can we see the screen? Thumbs up. Great. So the goal of the conversation that we're going to have for the next hour is to really highlight to you some things that concern me. What I want to do is talk to you a little bit about our research at the Citizen Lab. So Citizen Lab is based at the University of Toronto, and we try to work on digital security issues that arise out of human rights concerns. So a big part of our work is focused on trying to understand the different groups and entities that are currently trying to hack civil society. And it's important for you to know that all of the work that I'm going to show you is highly collaborative, both within the Citizen Lab and with other organizations. And I think the message is going to be that it's essential to have this kind of focused academic and collaborative work, often with peer review, if you want to investigate this case. So the roadmap for today, I'm going to give you a provocative statement. I'm going to tell you a pretty good story. I am going to present some evidence. And then I'm going to talk to you about the challenge as I see it right now. So getting started with the provocative statement. Commercial hacking tools are today's arms proliferation crisis. And I hope by the end of this, you come to agree with me. The result of this crisis is an epidemic of hacking and harm, much of it focused on civil society. All right, let me tell you a good story. Meet Omar Abdulaziz. Omar now lives in Canada. He's been a frank and hilarious critic of the Saudi regime now for years, and the Saudi government absolutely hates him. Not long ago, back in 2018, Omar ordered a tub of protein. Shortly after he placed his order, he got a text message on his phone. The text message appeared to come from DHL, and it promised information about the package that he had ordered. Unfortunately, the message that he got wasn't actually from DHL. It was designed to infect his device with a click. And had he clicked, and indeed he had, on the link, he would have gone to a server that would infect his device with a piece of malware that would make it remotely monitored and the contents of that phone available to whoever it was who was targeting him. The piece of spyware that was placed on his phone, the payload, would enable whoever was operating this to monitor his microphone, read his emails, look at his photos, screenshots, instant messaging, look at his files, and do everything that Omar could do on his phone, and some things that even he couldn't, like enabling the microphone and enabling the camera silently and without a blink. Let's talk a little bit about some of the capabilities of this spyware. So one thing that the spyware could do is it could, of course, monitor his chats. Well, who is Omar Abdulaziz chatting with? Omar was chatting with Jamal Khashoggi, who, as we know, was brutally murdered by the Saudi government at the beginning of October 2018 in Istanbul. During the time that Omar was targeted and hacked, he was in communication with Jamal. And he believes that his communications with Jamal, which involved planning activities for peaceful opposition in Saudi Arabia, may have been part of the dossier that led the Saudis to decide to target Jamal. But that's not the only thing that happened around Jamal Khashoggi's death with this piece of spyware. We know that both his wife and his fiancée were also targeted and infected with spyware. The spyware in question was made by a company called NSO Group, which goes by a bunch of different names and flags of convenience, but is ultimately owned by a UK-based private equity fund called Novalpina, and sells tools that it claims are lawful, that follow Israeli and local laws, and it only sells to governments. You may have heard of NSO Group recently because you heard that President François Mitterrand of France was potentially targeted with Pegasus spyware. You would have heard about this in the context of the Pegasus project, a project this summer by Amnesty International, Forbidden Stories, and a large consortium of journalist organizations that revealed that there were tens of thousands of potential targets for Pegasus spyware. We're going to come back to this project in the conversation, but I just wanted to flag this as why you may have heard it. Let's talk about some evidence. The context here is that there's an expanding commercial surveillance industry selling its products to an extraordinarily eager audience. The industry has conferences around the world and trade shows, just like any other industry. And at one point, if you were a government and you wanted to do sophisticated hacking and surveillance, you needed a massive STEM sector. You needed people trained in math and cryptography. Today, all you need is a checkbook. And you can buy many of the tools that only a decade or two ago were only available to sort of tier one powers. This is a really interesting problem set, and it's creating all sorts of challenges for the rest of us. Ultimately, the industry is large and has lots of pieces. There is a component of this industry that focuses on country scale monitoring people using advertising data, monitoring people using big data. Another component that focuses on interception and monitoring of networks. And finally, at the tip of this terrible spear is targeted spyware. For the purposes of this conversation, we're going to focus on targeted spyware. Ultimately, the industry itself is large. Many of the players are privately held. A couple of them are publicly held. I've noted a few here, including what I think gets the award for the creepiest slogan ever, which is ability. While others talk, we listen. Ultimately, the industry is in a period of radical growth right now, and is trying to pitch itself to governments with a value proposition. That value proposition is gaining it a lot of investor attention and a lot of growth. And part of what the industry is doing is allowing autocrats to clamber out of the analog age. Here's a picture from the Stasi archives in former East Berlin. This is the photograph of a teenager's bedroom, which the Stasi appears to have surreptitiously entered in order to photograph it because apparently they learned that the teenager was showing signs of Western tendencies. A sneak and peek operation now found in the Stasi archives. The Stasi, of course, had this problem. How do you surveil a whole country? How do you construct a massive surveillance apparatus? Well, in this case, it began in 7th grade. This is the path that the Stasi shows you for how to begin becoming a Ministry of State security agent beginning in 7th grade. 7th grade, 8th grade, 9th grade, 10th grade, the process that you follow for spying on your fellow countrymen. Obviously, this is a pretty creepy thing. But the Stasi had a problem. Unfortunately, an image is taking a minute to load, which is spying on people at some scale takes effort. Here's another great picture from the archives. This is all the same Stasi agent wearing his various disguises, showing how easy it is to blend in. And here we have another apparent Stasi agent monitoring a lot of different phone calls at once, or perhaps listening to bugs. Ultimately, there's a problem with this kind of analog surveillance, which is it's hugely expensive. And I just want to flag for you an amazing piece now a couple of years ago called Tiny Constables, The Cost of Surveillance, Making Sense Out of United States v. Jones by Kevin Bankston and Ashkan Soltani, two really interesting people as well. But basically, surveillance historically has been expensive. To surveil, you need spies. No longer, not in the same way. The public pitch of the targeted hacking industry is, look, we're going to sell you the technology to hack criminals and terrorists. In private, the pitch is a little bit different. They say, we're going to sell you the ability to hack anyone, more or less anywhere. And so the question is, what happens when you parachute a secret global hacking capability to unaccountable security services? The unsurprising answer? Well, we'll see. Here's Cyberbit, one of the companies that has sold offensive capabilities in the past at a trade show. And we see people wandering up and perhaps getting some demonstrations. Well, let's talk about one country that made an acquisition of Cyberbit's technology. Here we have PSS, the technology, which goes to Ethiopia. And what happens when Ethiopia, a notably repressive and autocratic regime, gets its hand on this technology? They use it. And they use it not only to spy domestically, but to spy on people around the world. It makes sense. If you're an autocrat, a lot of your perceived threat may come from outside, like your diaspora or journalists who choose to report on you. And the results of this kind of industry speak for themselves. Dozens and dozens, in this case, of academics and journalists and others got targeted with this spyware. Here's Saudi Arabia getting its hands on Pegasus. And what do they do with it? They conduct global spying. They don't limit themselves to targeting at home. And of course, as we saw above, they don't just target criminals or terrorists. They target their perceived enemies. If we look at the results of the Pegasus project that came out this summer, we see that the targets include activists, human rights defenders, journalists, publishers, aid workers, as well as family members, friends, doctors, assistants, and lovers. The dog's breakfast of targeting that autocratic and authoritarian and unaccountable surveillance entities will want to do. Speaking of journalists for a second, here's a case from a few years ago. Meet Javier Valdez. Javier was the publisher of Rio Doce, a small newspaper that had an outsized impact and a reputation for punching up by reporting on official corruption and the nexus between officialdom and cartels in Mexico. Here's the scene of his assassination. He was pulled from his car and brutally murdered. Reportedly, his phone and computer were taken and nothing else. Shortly after he was brutally gunned down in front of his office, his colleagues began receiving text messages. The text messages promised information about his killing. Of course, they weren't just text messages, and they weren't just offering information. These were attempts to hack them with NSO's Pegasus spyware. Here's Griselda, Javier's life partner. She also, after protesting official inaction in the investigation of his death, was targeted with Pegasus spyware, also promising information about his killing, noting she's also a journalist. Ultimately, when the Pegasus project came out this summer, we learned that tons of journalists from around the world were targeted with Pegasus spyware. Here's just a thumbnail from Mexico to Azerbaijan to India, a massive targeting of civil society. But what about government on government hacking? Well, this is something that we heard more about during the Pegasus project revelations, but we'd also been hearing about a bit in prior years. From the Pegasus project, we learned that 10 prime ministers, several presidents, and a king were among those targeted, along with a host of other officialdom. Now, at this point, some people may say, okay, I get it, targeting activists is a bad thing, but isn't targeting other heads of state fair game and perhaps arguably a legitimate action for an entity that's doing surveillance? Well, perhaps. Let's set aside the fact for a second that the company that manufactures this software doesn't claim that it's designed for this use, but rather talks about terrorists and criminals, and just follow the implications for a second. What happens when you take this kind of capability and hand it out around the globe is that government after government will use it to spy on each other. And ultimately, you create a scenario where more and more governments are capable of doing this kind of really intense surveillance, not only of their perceived opponents, but also of other governments. Where is this going? I don't know, but in its total version, it looks pretty dystopic. How does the spyware industry respond to the fact that for years, we, Amnesty International, and hosts of other media organizations have been reporting on their abuses? Well, some of their stuff is not exactly sophisticated. Here's NSO's CEO saying, don't believe newspapers when it comes to the role of his product in the murder of Jamal Khashoggi. But mostly, the industry is working to hone its narrative and buy influence. One of the key things that the industry has done for years is, we could say, pervert the term lawful intercept. Lawful interception actually has a pretty well-defined meaning. It describes a specific functionality in telecommunications equipment that enables judicial requests to be made for user data in accordance with legal standards in the relevant jurisdiction, and then the equipment provides access to these communications. What the industry does is borrow this terminology and basically say, look, anytime we sell this tech to government, if we assume that what the governments are doing is totally legal by their laws, then it's okay, then it's lawful. And they hide behind this terminology to basically sell a really problematic thing. But that's not the only fig leaf that they use. Another is the claim that the technology is used to target terrorists, pornographers, and other criminals. This is Eric Rabe, Hacking Team's PR guy. But of course, behind that reality, although there may be criminals and terrorists in there, are also journalists, activists, human rights defenders, and others. Over time, industry players, NSO is one of them, have gotten better at trying to talk the talk without necessarily walking the walk of human rights and due diligence. So here's a press release from NSO a couple of years ago announcing a new human rights framework, a goal to be in compliance with something called UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, and even anointing a series of new senior advisors. Well, these senior advisors have all left, and the abuses continued unabated after the announcement of this policy. Getting a little close to home, do you have a Harvard affiliation? Do you have a distinguished CV? Are you a former government employee? There's a chance that you will get approached by one of these industry players asking you to lend a bit of your credibility, a bit of your capital, and a bit of your name to their effort to try to persuade the world that what they're doing is legitimate. Don't bite. One way to look at this is that although the narrative coming from this industry is still changing, a couple of years ago, I don't think most of these players would have dreamed of portraying themselves as trying to meet standards of UN standards of rights and due diligence. Nevertheless, the abuse cases continue on Saudi Arabia. An interesting nuance of this case is that he had already complained to NSO about being targeted with Pegasus spyware when he was repeatedly infected again, which I think points as clear as day to the fact that you have an industry that is largely unaccountable. But go back a month further to September, and you have the phones of journalists who were targeting, or a journalist who was targeting Orban's childhood friend, vacationing with unexplained wealth, targeted with Pegasus. Back in August, Bahraini activists hacked with NSO Group spyware. In July, the mass of the Pegasus project, but also another firm called Kangaroo, also engaged in helping governments hack journalists around the world. The cases go on and they pile up. So let's talk a little bit about the challenge. The challenge is that the current form of the commercial surveillance industry, targeted hacking being a subset of that, is largely operating with impunity. What we know is largely dependent on third-party research and investigation because the industry is operating in secrecy. And the problem is we're all pretty sure that the industry is growing rapidly because these days we and other investigators find abuses wherever we scratch. The problem, well, the industry is having some mileage with its misleading claims of human rights and oversight. Unfortunately, despite the fact that there have been legal efforts by victims and lawyers representing them to try to get some kind of accountability, it does not appear yet that there are any serious remedies available to these victims. Ultimately, one way to look at this technology is as a repression multiplier for authoritarian regimes. It allows them to stifle free expression at home. It gives them total access that the Stasi would have drooled over to the private lives of their subjects and people who may run afoul of them wherever they are in the world. It helps autocratic regimes stay in power, and ultimately it allows them to export elements of their repression overseas, which is deeply troubling to the global project of democracy, given the resurgence of authoritarianism. At the same time, we're seeing that this kind of tech is a dangerous temptation for democracies. Well, for a couple reasons. First, in most societies, laws have not caught up to the capabilities of this tool. The implication of that is that even if police and other security services obtain these tools, they may not be using them with serious legal oversight, with obvious concerns for problem, given that these things have a proven abuse potential. We also see that this technology has a direct and chilling effect on the freedom of speech and freedom of expression. The fact of it existing in a state, the fact of a state having that kind of unaccountable access to people's most personal worlds on their cell phone is terrifying. And finally, when democracies obtain this stuff, especially if they're obtaining it from the global marketplace, they're actually supporting and helping to fuel problematic companies. Ultimately, the objective of many of these targeted hacking companies and the surveillance industry more generally is to grow, in many cases to go public, and to get to your local police force. They would like nothing more than the police department in your town to have access to their technology. This is a pretty terrifying reality. And you have to ask yourself, so how do we stop this harm? Is there, as many people would like to believe, a technical solution? Well, do you own an iPhone? Take a moment and think about it. If you own an iPhone, there's a pretty good chance that you got a notification that you needed to do an emergency update last month. Apple pushed out an update to all iPhones, all Macs, and even all Apple Watches to close a flaw that was being exploited in iPhones by NSO Group. This enabled NSO's customers to remotely and silently hack phones without any interaction and without any notification to the user. It's a terrifying thing. And ultimately, we can thank my colleague Bill Marzak for finding it in some forensic data, and to a civil society member who was targeted with it for giving this to our attention. But does patching, does updating, does finding these technological things, does finding the 0 days and vulnerabilities and closing them really stop NSO? Probably not. And the reason is that there's usually a way to hack phones. Companies like NSO can be thought of as more close to service providers in some ways and software developers. What they're really doing is selling to states for a given period of time the ability to remotely hack a phone and turn it into a bug in a person's pocket. And the specifics of how they do it may change based on a constant arms race with device manufacturers, but in the end, there will be access. So how do you effectively control this irresponsible global industry? It's a tough problem. I see this as something between a stool and a chair. It has a couple of parts: civil society, tech, and government. And unfortunately, government has been largely absent in this problem space as a solver of problems. Obviously, coming out of civil society, awareness is key. We do, Amnesty International and many other groups do a tremendous amount of research trying to help uncover the scope and scale of the problem set. But as I mentioned above, the problem is we only know a fraction of the total abuses, and information alone rarely changes behavior. And it certainly doesn't change behavior when you're dealing with actors that are as profitable, as unaccountable, and as reckless as some of these spyware players. So what do we need? Well, what about big tech? Interestingly, something has changed in recent years. For almost a decade or so, this technology was being used to target big tech platforms and big tech's customers and device manufacturers' customers, etc. And although tech, in some cases, focused on trying to control these things by blocking hacking, they weren't saying much about it publicly. In the last couple of years, that has radically changed. After WhatsApp discovered in an investigation that also involved Citizen Lab that 1,400 of their customers had been hacked or targeted with NSO Pegasus spyware in a 2-week period, they went ahead and notified the victims, and then they sued NSO. And what's interesting, and people may have missed it because it was happening around December, is that Microsoft, Google, and a host of other tech companies recently signed on to that ongoing lawsuit with an amicus brief. That lawsuit is working its way through the court process. What NSO is claiming, though, is really interesting. They're basically claiming that they can't be held accountable for what their customers do with the spyware because ultimately their customers are governments. Of course, this means that we basically have a company claiming that they bear no responsibility, no serious responsibility or accountability for their actions. But let's talk about government for a second. The problem with the spyware situation and government is that there are close industry-government ties, especially between rather developed countries that for years have had sophisticated tier 1 cyber capabilities, and the industry that has grown up often from people coming out of government and looking to turn their skills into marketable stuff. Ultimately, spyware cells are also a tool of soft power. If 20, 30 years ago, when you were trying to build a relationship with another country, one of the things on that country's wish list might have been weapons. Although weapons are still on the list, today, the hot commodity is hacking and monitoring ability. And it's easy to see why most states would want this extremely juicy thing. As a result, the industry benefits from a great degree of protection, whether it's Italy, the United States, the UK, Israel, Germany. There are close relationships between some parts of security states and these companies. But ultimately, the result of this has been a kind of a collective action problem. And the final outcome is that the phones of members of government, like the French cabinet, got targeted and infected, according to this report, with Pegasus spyware. Now, this is a really interesting report because it came from a government leak. One of the things that happened with the Pegasus project that was so interesting is that first France and then Belgium let it be known that they saw targeting of their own people, or that they confirmed the fact of this targeting, which is interesting. I think a few years ago, no government would have ever said that publicly. And it suggests that governments are increasingly aware that this technology does have a flip side and a potential cost to them and the security of their citizens. Interestingly enough, we're learning a lot about the impact of some of this hacking on diplomatic relationships. Suddenly, the fact of the expansion, in this case of Pegasus spyware, appears to have created serious diplomatic problems for Israel. Notably, according to this reporting, it sounds like Israel is the one trying to mend these relationships. We don't really know what NSO is doing, but we're not really hearing about what their role is in mending these relationships. Is there a little bit of accountability in the air? There was some fascinating reporting a couple of years ago from Reuters by Joel Schechterman and Chris Bing, who, if you don't know them, you should totally follow them, about something called Project Raven, which was a project of former NSA employees who went to the United Arab Emirates to sell their hacking skills, and ultimately to help the UAE build up an offensive capability. That capability was ultimately used, as we investigated at Citizen Lab and elsewhere, to target dissidents, to target critics, to target American citizens, and even to target one of my Citizen Lab colleagues. Now, what's interesting about this case is that after it was reported, there was sort of a bigger conversation. Is this a bad thing? Where is this going? Well, the DOJ has pushed down some indictments. And while the punishments for the former NSA employees who went and sold their skills don't appear to be that toothy, something really interesting happened in the press release from that indictment, which is, and I quote from the DOJ, "Left unregulated, the proliferation of offensive cyber capabilities undermines privacy and security worldwide." We've gotten to this place because governments are beginning to recognize the fact that this problem has blowback, and it isn't just something that you export that kills people far away. It's not like small arms that have a range measured in meters or miles. These are technologies that have the potential for global harm, and unsurprisingly, they're being used to cause global harm. People have proposed different things for what governments should do if they actually care. David Kay, former UN Special Rapporteur on freedom of expression, and others have suggested that there's a need for a current global moratorium, given how out of control the industry is on the sale and transfer of these technologies. Thinking a bit further down the road, people have proposed different ideas for how to deal with this problem. One seemingly core feature has to be that when any state uses this technology, whether they develop it at home, and it will be harder, if not indefensible, for things like your pension fund to be invested in this kind of industry. With that, I want to thank you for your attention to the presentation part of this. Here's my email if you've got questions. And ultimately, let's move on and have a conversation.
Terrific. Thank you so much, John, for your fabulous presentation. And it's very, very thought-provoking and frankly, a little scary. So I was wondering if you could clarify for our audience actually, could you take down the PowerPoint?
I believe I have.
Okay, great. Wonderful. Okay, so could you clarify for our audience the scope of government's usage of such programs. I don't even know if this information is entirely public. Like you've talked about the UAE, you've talked about Saudi Arabia, and I'm wondering if the governments involved are typically autocratic, unelected, or do you have democracies? Like, what's the scope and scale of government usage of such technologies?
I think every government worth its salt would either like to develop this technology at home or acquire it. And so the scope and scale is very large. You see Western democracies, Germany, for example, and others potentially obtaining this technology and using it, but you also see autocrats and you see sub-governmental security services, federal and regional services using it that don't necessarily have a lot of accountability or that have really awful track records of abuse and bad behavior with spyware. I think where we're going is most, if not all, governments in the world obtaining some elements of this complete breakfast of hacking capabilities. Where I think we need to be right now is, as much as possible, focused on trying to limit the harms of proliferation and have some impact on the marketplace while we still can.
Thank you for that. And in terms of the role of investor action, you talked about as like the fourth leg or the fourth pillar. And I'm wondering again, what is the feasibility of action in this regard, given that some of these companies are highly secretive, some of them are not public, some of them perhaps are registered in countries others than the ones in which we live and work. So what is the scope for thinking about business accountability in this digital age?
I think the scope is quite large. One of the things that I think is fueling the rapid growth of this industry is the fact that there is a desire on the part of the big players in this industry. You've heard a lot about NSO, but there are others to make a lot of money. And one way that they do that is by attracting a lot of investment and ultimately perhaps going public, even if they're going to use a SPAC. These are players that have chosen to be in the limelight and that have chosen to brag about their technology and make the case for it publicly. It needs to be the case that when investors are looking at this industry, they see as an object lesson these companies as ones where it is risky to involve yourself. And indeed, we see that previous acquisition talks for NSO failed. Novopina, which currently owns NSO, appears to have had major shakeups in the past several months, partly to do with the revelations from the Pegasus project. Ultimately, I think investors should understand not only are they, if they invest in this kind of thing, would they be harming human rights? They'd also probably be getting sideways to big tech, potentially a growing number of governments. And finally, they'd be exposing themselves to a tremendous amount of risk and not just reputational risk. And we've seen from the bumpy ride that surveillance companies have when they try to go public, that it's a risky space for investors. And I think investors are still learning just how risky it can be.
And do you have resources that you can suggest for people who are interested in individual investors or even like collective efforts? Who are the groups out there doing work in that space that we could learn more about?
So Citizen Lab has had extended correspondence for a couple of years with some of the different players that have invested in NSO and others. But I'd also point you to a recent publication, I think last week, from Amnesty International that walks through the kinds of questions that investors and others should be asking when they're thinking about the surveillance industry. At the end of the day, this is a growth industry. And I think the real debate is it like the fossil fuel industry or the cigarette industry or the gun industry? But ultimately, it's an industry that's producing serious global harm and has to sit in the part of the investor consciousness that says, this is a serious ESG problem. This is a serious source of potential risk.
So one of the areas of pushback I've received from people in the past when I've talked about technology in the context of human rights violations is that the underlying violations have been occurring for decades, if not centuries, right? In terms of how people have been surveilled and how people have been, rights have been violated, whether it's the right to privacy or more seriously, your right to life. And it is just that technology accelerates its process. It allows us to do it much quicker, easier, perhaps cheaper, undercover. But I'm wondering if you can just touch on this issue of why human rights organizations and the community need to think about rights differently in this digital age, and thinking about security and privacy, not just as luxuries, but really as essential to us achieving all of our rights.
This is a good question. And I think sometimes a reaction people are going to have to learning more about the surveillance industry is, well, haven't people spied on each other forever? Sure. One could say the same thing about the arms industry. Haven't people killed other people forever? Since forever? Sure. The difference is the surveillance industry, just like the arms industry, allows for an outsized scale of impact and harm. So it's a multiplier of human rights violations. And ultimately, it's a multiplier of the impact that the industry is having around the world. 10, 15 years ago, if you were working in human rights, one of the things that a lot of human rights organizations were thinking about was physical security for human rights organizations, because there would be raids, surveillance, burglaries, and so on. So there was an effort to invest in helping human rights defenders around the world try to better protect themselves. Unfortunately, in the last decade and a half, we've seen a lot of those gains eroded. And the reason is, although technology has been a profound enabler of communication, in fact, it has righted historic asymmetries in the access to the means of communication between people and governments, including human rights defenders and governments, repressive regimes, it has not removed core asymmetries of risk and therefore power and danger between people and governments. And at the end of the day, the hacking industry is really the other shoe dropping on the powerful impact that technology has had, or one of the other shoes dropping on the powerful impact that technology has had on the human rights space. Today, it is possible, if you run an autocrat equipped with this kind of technology, to not just harm people at home, to harm people within your borders, or a few people outside of them, but to really be an outsized player in harming people. And it goes a little bit further than that. At the end of the day, the glue for an authoritarian regime is lies and fear. That clotted mix is held together with fear. And what tools like Pegasus allow autocrats to do is to make people around the world afraid of them, afraid of the possibility that Saudi Arabia could be in their phone if they say something critical about the Saudi government, if they report on Saudi Arabia, if they're a lawmaker who's concerned about Saudi Arabia. We have all in this space had these conversations with people who are having to weigh the possibility in a way that they never did before, that suddenly Mohammed bin Sultan is looking at their kid pics because they, as a European legislator, have expressed a concern over his human rights record. That's a terrifying reality. And at the end of the day, one of the things that's so important for democracy is to prevent the spread of digital authoritarianism. And if we can't control this industry, then there's nothing that we can really do to prevent these autocrats from really exporting their fear into our borders and into our space of discourse. It's not just Gulf money that's paying for advocates in DC and for lobbying. It's also Gulf hacking technology that has people afraid of reporting on Gulf abuses. And the same version of that problem is repeated again and again around the world with other regional and country contexts.
So you've talked a bit about transnational repression, right? Where there's somebody living in Canada and they're being hacked by somebody in another country. A question from our audience is whether domestic surveillance should be included in this discussion for more accountability from domestic agencies. And in the US context, for example, I'm thinking about the power of police agencies, for example, and other agencies like ICE, Immigrations and Customs Enforcement, to conduct very, very sophisticated surveillance of our movements, our actions, everything. So what are your thoughts about the connection between this transnational surveillance and domestic surveillance?
Part of why I think me and so many others are concerned about the surveillance marketplace is because we have historical examples of police and security services using technologies secretly in ways that push or overstep or trample on constitutional rights. And those examples exist in the United States as well. What keeps me up at night is the thought of 100 American police departments getting Pegasus-like hacking capabilities and the sheer scale, ultimately, of rights abuses, fear, and harm that could come from that.
And another question from our audience is about what entities do you envision as best equipped to address these issues? The UN, question mark, question mark.
I think we're in a weird place with the internet where for a couple decades, the norms around the internet have been largely defined by big corporations and government. And the problem is that framing has left civil society largely out of the conversation. And as a result, a lot of the harms that have been happening to civil society over the past decade or two have been lowballed. And nowhere is that more true than when it comes to hacking. I think the UN can serve an important role in framing certain norms. I don't think UN World Police are going to head over and stop some of these abusers of spyware. However, accountability is critical, and norm shaping and international agreements around norm shaping are really important. At the end of the day, one of the best things to restrain state power is states themselves and democracies making a choice to be accountable and intentional in what technologies they vest themselves with. What scares me about technologies that allow for this kind of invasive hacking is that once governments and officials get a taste of them, they don't want to let them go, and they have every incentive to hide their use of them. This is really troubling because we see from historical cases, whether it's the surveillance of rights movements in the United States in the 1960s, all the way to surveillance in Latin America throughout the last half century, to surveillance around the world, there's just an insatiable appetite, even among surveillance security services in ostensibly democratic regimes, to abuse this sort of technology in ways that cause durable and lasting harm to social movements, to progress, and to change.
So another question from our audience is about pension funds investments. So what is the reaction of pension funds to their association with abuses if they're investing in certain companies?
This is a great question because pension funds wield a huge amount of investment power. They're big institutional investors, and they can do a lot, and they don't like being challenged. But they're also increasingly accustomed to having different interest groups pushing them on investing in certain areas and framing this as a problem set. My hope is that we get towards a place where pension funds see the surveillance sector as a big no-go, and ultimately as a place where if they invest in that, it may directly erode the mandates and mission of the organization whose pension they manage. I think we're getting to that place. I think it will be tremendously meaningful when we're talking about investments for big universities, university endowments, to basically come out and say, look, we have no interest in investing in this kind of surveillance industry. This is off limits to us. I think we have to hope that other investing groups will do similar things.
So I'd like to talk about the individual perspective. And I know you mentioned earlier on that, you know, there aren't sort of neat individual solutions like you could update your phone, but in this era, how can we best educate ourselves and ensure that we are safe, whether we are a human rights activist or a journalist or, you know, in some other way commenting on these issues?
If you're a member of civil society and you have an urgent digital security concern, I urge you to get in touch with the Access Now hotline. This is a helpline that's made available to people in civil society, journalists, human rights defenders, humanitarians, and others who may be facing substantial risk because of who they are and what they do. You can find that online by Googling it. If you're just a person watching this and you don't necessarily think that you fall into that category, but you're curious about this stuff, one thing that I want you to know is that there are simple things that you can probably do today that will make it harder for bad actors to hack you. Maybe not something you can do today to stop Pegasus, but certainly something that you can do to raise the cost to gaining access to your digital life. And one thing that I want to point you towards is an online resource called the Security Planner. You can find it by Googling it. It was originally developed partly by us at the Citizen Lab. We've handed it over to Consumer Reports, the independent organization that does product testing. And it provides you with expert, customized suggestions for how to be safer online, including resources for dealing with problems like cyber stalking, intimate partner surveillance, as well as other urgent issues if you believe you're facing an ongoing digital security problem. I would encourage you to think about these things as things that you can do today that will make you better. At the end of the day, that will make you more secure. At the end of the day, though, part of why I'm talking to you is because I want you to hold officials accountable for their inaction on this and ask questions when you have the opportunity or take the opportunity about what's going. Engage with the issue on social media, engage with the problem of commercial spyware. Right now, you're in a position to do an outsized impact wherever you are.
And what about engaging with elected officials or even with pension funds or investing, in addition to sort of ensuring our own individual safety and security? Are there things that we could do as public citizens in ensuring a more safe public sphere?
If you're watching this and you're concerned about human rights, you probably don't want your money to be spent paying for these companies to continue growing and pitching their product to more autocrats and authoritarians. Take a moment to look into your pension fund or your investments and see whether they have stuff that addresses this. They probably don't. Drop them an email, let them know. Feel free to message your elected officials and let them know that this is something that you're concerned about. One thing that people may wonder is, why are we talking about this commercial industry when we know that developed states have all these surveillance capabilities? And they absolutely do. And they're absolutely something that you should be concerned about. The answer is, this is another problem. It's growing really fast and it's harming people around the world, including people who have much less of a say in what their governments do. And I think it is important for all of us to try to do what we can to rein this industry in and slow it down.
One other resource I wanted to point out in the US context, I think it is in the US context, is the Atlas of Surveillance, which documents the use of technology by police in communities. So I'm giving a talk, it's a virtual talk in a couple of weeks, and I looked up the town in which the talk is happening, the university where it's based, and I found all kinds of interesting information around the agreement that the police department has signed with Amazon's home surveillance equipment company, Ring, for example, or its use of automatic license plate readers, shot spotter, gunshot detection, and so on. And so it's very interesting. We're talking about surveillance happening halfway around the world, but we're also living in highly, highly surveilled communities. And I think part of what we have to think about is that interplay between what's happening globally and what's happening around the world. So I'm just looking at the questions that have been coming in, and one question was, what can I do as an individual other than updating my software and writing to my congressman or congresswoman, I guess. And I think you somewhat covered that. And then you've talked about ways in which journalists and civil society organizations can tap into resources like Access Now and Consumer Reports and so on. I'm just going through the questions of this. Any other questions, feel free to post them. One question that has come up is around international law. What kind of international law would be useful in deterring and preventing future hacking events? Do we need to think about trade restrictions as we think about government-to-government hacking?
This is a really good question. I am not an international law expert, but I would say there are some really interesting people working on this area and publishing interesting stuff. One thing that was quite interesting with the lawsuit that WhatsApp brought against NSO Group is that NSO is trying to use defenses related to sovereign immunity. And this is an old body of law and international law, touches on maritime things, lots of other fun places. And I would encourage you, if you're interested in the legal conversations around this kind of stuff, to check out that case and to check out one of the amicus briefs from a group of legal scholars who have argued that NSO's use of these legal approaches is probably wrong. One of the things that I think is important to think about is that international law can be an important tool. International human rights law can be an important tool when dealing with abuses. And I think there's a lot more room for it to be abused, there's a lot more room for it to be used here. This space could also use more international law experts and others who are interested in the application of international law to these problems. I think it's an exciting field, and for the same reason that surveillance industry people look at this and say, man, this is the Wild West, look at all the things we can do. I think people who are legal scholars can look at this and say, man, look at the impact that I could have bringing some of my conceptual toolkit to this problem space.
I think I would also say that, the people who are on the ground, who are closest to some of the problems and challenges, are probably the best equipped to think of innovative ways to mobilize against this. And I'm interested if you've seen examples, or if Citizen Lab has partnered with other groups in this regard, like, civil society organizations in different countries. And how do you approach those partnerships, and what kind of knowledge bases do you draw on in your work?
One of the things that I think is most important about the work that we do is that none of it could happen if it wasn't for partnership with targeted individuals and organizations. The way that we investigate is by working with people who are already targeted or potentially going to be targeted, and collaborating with them to try to identify problems. Our long-term goal is for many of the organizations that we work with and collaborate with to be able to do more and more parts of the investigative work themselves, to be able to find and hold some accountability. I would point to Mexico as a really interesting example of collaboration, where Citizen Lab worked really closely with 3 Mexican civil society organizations, R3D, Socialtic, and Article 19. These 3 organizations worked directly with us to build out an investigation of potential targets, and ultimately to analyze the devices for evidence of Pegasus targeting, and then do follow-on advocacy. At the end of the day, there are some things that we can do as a global audience for this problem, but where a lot of the change is going to happen is in any given domestic context. Like so many problems with a global scope, there isn't one area that's going to address it or one frame that's going to solve it. It has to be all of them, including people in different countries. One of the things that is, I think, most frustrating to me is that civil society organizations are chronically under-resourced, operating on a shoestring, and yet they play such an important role in safeguarding and promoting democracy. And when they're targeted with sophisticated attacks, it really taxes their capacity to the max and often overwhelms it. And ultimately, part of the conversation about the vulnerability of civil society to hacking is also a conversation about the fact that civil society deserves more of our support.
Thank you. That was really, really powerful and spot on. So I'm wondering, you've talked exclusively about phones. So I'm wondering, is that the primary vehicle for getting into a person's information and location and so on, or is it also one's laptop or, other kinds of devices or home phones? And so maybe I'll just start with that question.
Well, we have talked mostly about phones, and I think there are a lot of reasons for that, including the fact that I think all of us here know that the most interesting window into our souls is our telephone. But it is absolutely the case that the industry sort of began by targeting computers, and indeed still plugs along doing exactly that. So for example, Citizen Lab has invested in Kangaroo, which sells hacking technology against like laptop operating systems. So earlier this year, we worked with Microsoft, which pushed out some updates disabling Kangaroo's government-exclusive spyware, and noting the fact that it was being used to target human rights defenders and others in different countries around the world. Ultimately, there is no device that you as an individual can obtain that is not subject to the grasp of an authoritarian regime or a well-resourced regime if they want access to it. That's not in itself a game over phenomenon. The locks on our homes wouldn't survive a battering ram, let alone a bulldozer, nor would the locks on our windows. And yet we lock our doors and feel a degree of security. I think with digital security, we have to get to a similar place where we at least know the scope and scale of the problem and know what we're defending against. Right now, most of us are in a position where we still don't know all the potential threats that could come at us. The important thing is not to lose hope, but to rather feel empowered by the knowledge that we now do have and inspired by the kinds of advocacy and impact that are happening all around us.
So I have one last question for you, which is, how does this work on tracking and exposing and holding accountable these sort of very sophisticated hacking efforts, align with efforts out there to challenge the use of facial recognition or sophisticated surveillance? For example, I saw that Amazon is going to be doing palm scanning technology at when you go to big events, you can identify who the person is. or even the efforts to challenge Facebook and other social media platforms around the commodification of our data and the spread of misinformation. So how does this fit into this broader landscape of accountability?
In a sense, we're in this interesting position where so many parts of our world now have a digital intercessor or have been modified or fundamentally changed by technology. And it's unsurprising that in this highly disrupted time, new players are gaining power and influence, are trying to influence us, are trying to make money off of us. In some cases, are trying to harm us. That inverted pyramid that I showed in my talk had all these different pieces: interception, big data surveillance, and ultimately targeted hacking. Targeted hacking is one component of the problem. And in some ways, it's pretty salient because we can all think about what it would mean to have a person who we don't like gain access to our entire digital life. And in the words of Craig Timberg, the journalist, dump it out on the table in front of people who wish us ill. It's a terrifying thought, and it's really salient. But at the end of the day, it sits as part of a broader ecosystem of accountability and efforts to try to limit the harm caused by surveillance and other problems. One of the things that I think is so important is the work done by colleagues, including mine at Citizen Lab, who don't work on targeted hacking, but who work on surveillance reform, big data surveillance, facial recognition, and a whole host of other topics. I think at the end of the day, we're in a position where we as consumers of information about potential threats to us and potential things are pretty overwhelmed. Every day there's a story about hacking, every day there's a story about a breach, every day there's a story about some kind of abuse. And I think we're going to eventually get to a place where we don't ignore this, but rather are able to apply the concepts that a lot of us learned beforehand about state power, about repression, and reapply those into the digital sphere. I think one of the takeaways that I've had from the decade or so that I've worked on this issue is, as the French say, the more things change, the more they stay the same. Although it's true that this industry is fueling a massive proliferation, a massive scale of harm, ultimately, as you pointed out earlier, what states are doing with this technology is not different than what they've been doing all along. It may just be at a different scale, and it may have a different a geographic scale as well. One of the things that I think is so important as you're listening to this conversation, other conversations around social media companies right now and other things, is to think that we're in a position right now where we're starting to learn the other side of a lot of the technologies that we've allowed in the past decade or two. And it's really important that we not ignore the writing on the wall about harms, and that we pay attention and heed the voices of people who are warning us about these technologies. 10 years ago, a lot of the warnings around social networking, for example, felt a bit conceptual, felt a bit abstract. Now they're backed by hard and solid data. And I think one by one, the same thing is going to happen in every area around surveillance. The real question is, how much harm do we have to pay before we start recognizing that this has happened?
Thank you so much for joining us today, John, and thank you for your work at Citizen Lab.
Thank you so much for having me. And again, I just want to highlight that all of this work is entirely dependent on collaborations, both with my brilliant colleagues, I name-checked a few like Bill Marzak, but others as well, and collaborations with other organizations. And most critically and importantly, nothing that I presented to you today from our work could have happened without the collaboration of victims and targets of this kind of surveillance. And it is from their bravery that the fruits of this research come. So I want to thank and acknowledge them.
That's a great reminder. I think all of us live in a broader ecosystem, and our successes are really collective successes in terms of uplifting the work of others who perhaps were not